It looks like the United States and Ukraine have reached an agreement on a peace plan, at least according to US officials. But what that actually means is not at all clear. Do not expect peace to arise overnight in Ukraine. Still, we should spend some time discussing what is known about the deal, how Russia is likely to respond to it, and the broader US political context of the situation. And that last point is perhaps the most important, because it seems to be driving everything with this peace process. For background, the big news story for the last week has been the various pushes for a ceasefire in Ukraine, beginning with an apparently Russian-written plan leaked last Friday, followed by a European plan that leaked 2 days later. All of this scrambled diplomats in Ukraine, the rest of Europe, and the United States to agree to terms, with a looming Thanksgiving deadline coming from Trump. This turkey had nothing to fear, of course. It was getting pardoned. But Kyiv and every other European capital worried that the White House would firmly adopt the Russian plan to carve up Ukraine like some perfectly brined white meat straight off the breast, perhaps with a side of Brussels sprouts. That fear appears to be for naught, though. We do not have a full copy of the U.S.-Ukraine peace deal, which I, for one, am very thankful for, because I do not think I have another hour-long video in me this week. However, we do have some headline information about what U.S. officials say is an agreement, and what Ukrainian officials indicate is more of a framework with some final details still needing to be sorted out. At least there is consensus between the two that Russia will need to be included in the discussion before anything becomes official. Just replace Merkel and Macron with Trump here, and you get the picture. In any case, the key point that is leaked about the US-Ukraine plan is that there will be no territorial concessions involved. Now, I suspect that means that Ukraine is fine with freezing along the line of control, and implicitly understanding that Russia will have de facto rule over the areas that it has occupied. This has, more or less, been Ukraine's position since February, the last time it seems that we were in the midst of Western diplomatic chaos. But a freeze is much better for Ukraine than what the Russian-authored plan called for, specifically forcing Ukraine to retreat out of the Donbass. The problem here is that a U.S.-Ukraine bilateral peace deal is meaningless. The United States and Ukraine are not at war. Well, sometimes they are at a war of words, but they are not the ones engaging in kinetic action over in Eastern Europe. No, the second actor that matters here is Russia, not the United States. And back in Moscow, the Kremlin offered a standard diplomatic response to the announcement, that it welcomes efforts to reach a resolution to the war, but it warns that any efforts to twist the original Russian proposal would kill the deal. Well, if the reports are accurate that territorial concessions are not on the table, then I think that we can consider the deal dead, which means we have all been spinning our wheels for the last 5 days for no real purpose. I should further note that the Ukrainian delegation has been quiet about what is happening on the territorial concessions front. So take everything based on hearsay with a grain of salt. You might remember that in the first video of this saga, I suggested taking a deep breath and just wait to see how this plays out. Now you can see why. Hope you were relaxing on a beach somewhere instead of following this whole thing. We are really starting to get vibes of faux momentum, like was the case coming out of the Alaska summit. Actually, you may want to stay on the beach, because there is still some time for Russia to scrutinize what non-territorial concessions may be in the deal. That kicks the can further down the road, which is seemingly a Russian sub-goal. And it is always possible that those early reports are wrong, and we will all be back here tomorrow with some firmer information. Regardless, I think it is worth spending more time trying to understand why there is so much chaos in the Trump administration right now. Because there is a deeper story that will have critical political implications for the next 3 years. I will do my best to recount what is happening, but there is a lot of conflicting information right now, even on basic facts like a timeline of the construction of the peace proposals. So bear with me. The short version of things is that Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State / Acting National Security Advisor Marco Rubio are in the middle of a White House internal power struggle. But it is not just about current policies. It is also about the future of the Republican Party. As the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance is the default Republican nominee for the 2028 presidential election. Betting markets put his chances at 52.5% for that nomination. And who is his chief competitor? Well, the field is crowded, but Marco Rubio is second in the betting odds at 8%. And as Secretary of State, he holds the next highest ranking cabinet post, which makes him the default choice among Republicans who do not want to see a continuation of the MAGA movement. Now, as we discussed earlier this week, Trump has a hands-off approach to crafting public policy. He lets others form the policy, and then through some opaque process, decides what to ultimately pursue. And this is where the fractures in the White House become glaringly obvious. Vance and Rubio have very different views on the role of the United States in global politics, and they are both trying to win Trump's favor, all in the shadow of the 2028 campaign. Vance, to keep things simple, wants the United States to take a step back abroad. We have seen this with his skepticism of U.S. involvement against the Houthis earlier in the year, thanks to the signal leaks. And we are seeing it now as well in Ukraine. Here, Vance summarizes his thought process. Any Ukraine-Russia peace plan has to 1. Stop the killing while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty, 2. Be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine, 3. Maximize the chances the war does not restart. Every criticism of the peace framework the administration is working on either misunderstands the framework or misstates some critical reality on the ground. There is a fantasy that if we just give more money, more weapons, or more sanctions, victory is at hand. Peace won't be made by failed diplomats or politicians living in a fantasy land. It might be made by smart people living in the real world. Vance has the first three premises correct, and I can understand why he is frustrated by a lot of the Western conversation that a peace plan can ignore Russia's military veto. You have to get both parties to consent. It is just how things work. However, his argument falls apart as he tries to draw his conclusions, even ignoring the Diplomacy 101 problems in the original Russian text. As stated, it basically says that the United States and Europe are incapable of militarily coercing Russia. That is not true, but it requires effort that is not forthcoming from the United States, and as much as Europe hates to hear this, effort that Europe still has not brought forth in sufficient quantities. A better version of this post, one that I do not necessarily agree with, just looking at this in terms of pure argumentation, is as follows. If voters truly cared about the issue on both sides of the Atlantic, then they should be calling their representatives to get more aid passed. If this has not happened over the course of nearly 4 years, then perhaps it is time to move on. Well stated or not, Vance has that mindset, and he appears to be personally apathetic as to which side receives a more favorable deal. Because when Vance says that the deal has to be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine, he is implicitly capturing how bargaining ranges can be large. And as we lines on maps enthusiasts all know, there are significant distributional consequences for choosing one versus another. Vance's proxy in these negotiations has been Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army. That is a weird position to run a diplomatic effort, until you realize that Vance and Driscoll are old friends from Yale Law School. That is why Driscoll, who, like Steve Witkoff, has no prior diplomatic experience, is involved in these negotiations. And it shows just how much of a shadow Vance is casting on the talks, even if he is not physically present for them. So Moscow took advantage of the situation and wrote a peace deal that looks very favorable for Russians, and likely too favorable for Ukraine to accept. But no matter. Eventually, they may bargain down to something still very tilted in Russia's favor. Meanwhile, anyone who is more invested in the distributional consequences of a peace deal looked at the initial proposal and thought it was trash. Rubio, it seems, is one such person. Hence why he allegedly told a group of senators that it was not the U.S. position. But then when the senators publicly said that, Rubio had to publicly deny it, lest it cause problems within the White House. Rubio's concerns here are twofold. First, as a simple policy matter, he almost certainly dislikes the deal given his more traditional conservative foreign policy positions. Second, he does not want to be politically associated with a deal that online commentary loves to compare to Munich. Here is the thing. This policy is not popular in the United States. It is not even popular within the president's coalition. And I have brought the polling data to back up my claim. Looking at just Trump voters, not voters overall, just Trump voters, only 16% support Ukraine making territorial concessions to end the war. 46% are against it. More tellingly, month after month, a majority of Trump voters blame Putin for the failure to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine. Blame of Zelensky has trended downward. And the kicker is that blame of Trump is on the rise. Even MAGA conservatives feel that way. After the 2024 presidential election, it is easy to forget that since 2016, Republicans have fared poorly whenever Trump does not appear on the ballot. Trump just reaches a political audience that does not normally participate, and his rising tide lifts all other Republican votes. But when he is not on the ballot, those Republicans are not getting the votes. And that has made a lot of Republicans uneasy after this year's special elections have not gone well. The 2026 midterms are less than a year away, and a presidential campaign will soon follow that. It is a big reason why you have seen more congressional Republicans breaking from Trump as of late. It is par for the course when you have a lame duck president, and it is only going to get worse for Trump as his presidency draws to a close. So put yourself in Rubio's shoes. You can see these poll numbers. You want to win a Republican primary, right? Well, on the foreign policy front, the way to do it is to not copy the J.D. Vance philosophy. Rubio is having to take charge of negotiations with Ukraine, because failure to do so will lead to Trump only having the Vance plan put in front of him. Rubio wants an alternative because he thinks that it will make for better policy, and he also needs the ability to wash his hands of the situation if something more Vance-like comes into effect. He needs to corner the market of moderate Republicans and traditional conservatives. They were drowned out by MAGA Republicans while Trump was on the ballot. But that will not be the case in 2026 or 2028. This is Rubio's way of making a move. And that, it seems, is why we are where we are. Meanwhile, if you want to take a break from the U.S. political jockeying, these two books on the war have a much greater international focus. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you tomorrow. Nope, I hope not tomorrow. Goodness, I've been doing this too much. I will see you next time. Take care.